Welcome to the Infinite Wealth Podcast, where we teach clients how to build wealth and create passive income without the risk of Wall Street.
Welcome to the Infinite Wealth Podcast. I'm Cameron Christensen, along with our co-host Anthony Faso. Anthony, how are you?
I'm doing good. I'm real excited for our guest here, David McKnight. I've had read his books and watched his DVDs, and really, we're just honored that he's taken the time to spend here on the Infinite Wealth Podcast.
As am I. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me, guys.
David, I want to start off just with a question to see if I can trick you. Okay. What's going to happen in 6 years, 4 months, and 3 days from now?
6 years, 4 months, and 3 days from now.
I got this from your website.
Oh, tax rates are going up?
Exactly, right? Now,
that number may not be right. It should be going up, really January 1st, 2026. So that 4 months has me thrown off a little bit.
Okay, perfect. So why are taxes? I thought taxes just went down. How are they going to go up in 6 years, and 3 days from now?
Well, so at the end of 2017, they passed the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. They squeaked it right in right before Christmas. And what that did was, because they didn't have a super majority in the House and Senate, they had to do it under what's called budget reconciliation, which means they had to have a simple majority, which means that they couldn't enact a permanent tax cut. So the deal that you get when you work through budget reconciliation is there's an expiration date. They call it a sunset provision. So they were only able to get 8 years worth of tax cuts. And similar to the tax cuts that George Bush pushed through in 2003, these are going to expire, and they're going to expire January 1st, 2026. So, it used to be people would say, hey, Dave, when are tax rates going up? I'd say, gosh, great question. Maybe 10 years from now, some distant, unknowable future. But now people say, when are tax rates go up? I say, I can tell you the year and the day when tax rates go up, which is critical because it helps you make important financial planning decisions with a little bit more, accuracy, a little bit more sense of confidence, knowing that you have really, if you count this year, you got 7 years within which to make those important tax moves.
Do you think it's possible for them to keep them in place, or maybe even lower them?
Sure. Anything's possible. I think that it was from a financial perspective. I love low taxes just like the next guy. Mm-hmm. From a financial perspective, I think that this was a fiscally irresponsible move because it was not accompanied by a commensurate reduction in spending. In fact, it's going to cost $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years to be able to pay for these tax cuts. So I think that they could, if you had a Republican-controlled House, Senate, and presidency, I think they could extend these things. But I think that so many of the fiscal problems that are plaguing our country will have compounded so much by that point that I think it would really, really hard pressed to extend these tax cuts without a commensurate cut in spending and a dramatic and radical reformation of entitlement programs.
I agree. Absolutely. I agree. And David, you're the author of the best-selling book, The Power of Zero, right? Which we've got here. And in that book, the first part of it is all about reasons why tax rates will increase. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's the first chapter is called A Gathering Storm. Basically, I make the case that, hey, we're at historically low tax rates today. We've never seen tax rates this low. With the exception of a year or two in the early 90s, we haven't seen tax rates this low in our lifetime. And come 2026, those tax rates are going to revert right back to what they were in 2017. So we really have a 7-year period of time within which to enjoy historically low tax rates. And then all of these poor fiscal decisions that we've made as a country are going to start to catch up with us. There's going to be a day of reckoning. There's going to be a point where we can no longer pay for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the interest on the national debt. We will have painted ourselves effectively into a corner financially And we will be forced to raise taxes or default on debt, which would precipitate a global-wide, worldwide depression. So we're not going to do that. So we will get to a point where tax rates not only have to rise, but have to rise dramatically just to keep us out of bankruptcy as a country.
Thanks for sharing that. And I was going to say, if you could, one of the things that I enjoy about our podcast is getting to interview guys like yourself that look at all this data and is able to kind of interpret it and then provide a message. Where did the message come from, right? I mean, the message that you have in the book is rising taxes. Where did that originate, right? And so maybe how you got started in the career, a little bit more in the background there.
Yeah, so I got into the industry in 1997. I got into the financial services industry, and I always believed in tax-free. It wasn't until I started to learn about a guy named David Walker that I really started to become attuned to the future of tax rates. David Walker was a former comptroller general of the federal government. He did that under Bush and Clinton, so he did it for 10 years. He's in a very bipartisan way. He basically stood before Congress and said, hey, look, if we don't double tax rates, we could go broke as a country. He even wrote a CNN op-ed article talking about how we could go broke as a country if tax rates don't double. And that inspired me to take that message to Americans across the country. I do about 85 speaking events per year where I speak to rooms full of people. And by the way, I say, hey, how many of you guys think the tax rates in the future are likely to be higher than they are today? Nearly every hand in the room goes up. And then when I say, how many of you guys have the lion's share of your assets, your retirement assets in tax-deferred vehicles like 401ks and IRAs? Nearly every hand in the room goes up. So there's a clear disconnect between what people believe and what they think about the future of tax rates and how they're actually preparing themselves financially to be able to deal with it. So there's this massive disconnect. And part of my job, and I imagine your jobs as well, is to try to bridge that disconnect so people's actions are conforming to the way that they're thinking.
Why do you think there's such a disconnect there between the two, right? I've seen the same thing over my career. You can ask anybody that comes and sits down in front of you, think taxes are going up? Yes, absolutely. Well, what are you doing about it? Nothing, right? Well, why is that?
Oh, yes, force of habit. When we put dollars into 401ks and IRAs, we get a tax deduction. Okay, we have become addicted to tax deductions. We think that the primary reason or the primary purpose for a retirement account is to give us a tax deduction, and we forget that the real purpose of a retirement account is to maximize cash flow at a period in our lives when we can least afford to pay taxes. So really, it's force of habit. I think people love the tax deduction. They love kicking the can down the road. They've been told in popular media that tax rates will be lower in retirement because maybe there's a sense that you'll be living on less income. Therefore, the mathematically appropriate move is to put money into a 401k or IRA, get the tax deduction. But I think more and more people are waking up to the reality that tax rates will most likely be dramatically higher even 10 years from now. So mathematically speaking, you're better off putting money into tax-free accounts.
I would tell you, Brian, one thing that really hit home to me when I realized that falsity that we're going to be in a lower tax bracket when I retire is when I had my CPA firm. I remember particularly I did taxes for my son's kindergarten teacher. But at this point, he was maybe about 18 or 20 years old, and she had retired, and she was married. And so she had a pension and some Social Security. But what had happened when her husband passed away, so she was getting two Social Securities. When one spouse passes, the couple gets the higher Social Security. So she lost, I think it was about maybe $1,500, $2,000 a month, right? But her expenses, for the most part, stayed the same because they're staying in the same house, same property tax, utilities, maybe food went down a little bit, but also her tax rate went up because now instead of being married filing jointly, she's now filing single. So I call the double whammy. Her cash flow went down and her taxes went up. And here is this poor woman who, she sacrificed being a teacher and had a nice pension. But the problem was that's taxable. If she had some money in the IRA, that's taxable. Her Social Security at that point is taxable. And one thing I tell people is, like, what's your biggest tax? Like, Cameron, I'll ask you, what are your two biggest tax deductions?
Qualified plans, if I'm doing one.
No, like for you is your kids.
Sure.
Your kids and your mortgage. What do you expect to happen when you're in retirement? Even if the kids are living at home, you're not going to get a tax deduction anymore, right? And hopefully your house is paid off potentially. So even if your income were to stay the same, your tax deductions are going to go away. And then you throw in you have all this deferred income. I mean, you could very easily be in a higher tax bracket. And particularly for our listeners, a lot of them are going to have some investment income or some businesses and some other sources. They need to start being not just focused on the taxes today, but we need to look at the big picture. What would be the taxes over our entire life? Sorry, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent there, but we start talking taxes, I get a little excited.
Absolutely. Is there a question in there?
No, there was. There's.
One of the things that I really like about the book and also your movie is, David, you're there to educate somebody, but then you also are trying to motivate them or getting them to act and giving them options, right? Could you maybe touch on some of the strategies that you suggest that people start implementing today?
Yeah, I really take a sort of a balanced, comprehensive approach to tax-free retirement. I feel like one of my big takeaways in my workshop is it's nearly impossible to get to the 0% tax bracket by using just one stream of tax-free income. For example, it's very, very difficult to get to the 0% tax bracket by just using, say, a Roth IRA, traditional Roth IRA, contributing, $7,000 a year. Very, very difficult to get to the 0% tax bracket by just using, what I talk about in chapter 5 of my book, a life insurance retirement plan, LIRP. To get to the 0% tax bracket typically requires 5 or 6 different streams of tax-free income, none of which show up on the IRS's radar, but all of which contribute to you being in the 0% tax bracket. So a typical recommendation that I might make for someone who's angling for the 0% tax bracket might be, hey, let's make sure we're fully funding your Roth IRAs every year. Let's make sure that if you have too much money in your tax deferred bucket in the form of an IRA or 401k, let's make sure we're taking advantage of Roth conversions. Because of the Roth conversion, we can get that IRA or 401k balance skinny down to the point where it produces an RMD at age 70 and a half, which gets offset by your standard deduction, but also low enough that it doesn't cause provisional income thresholds to be so high that your Social Security can be taxed. And we also talk about the LIRP, like I said in chapter 5 of my book, which is a sort of a safe and productive way to grow at least a portion of your assets. And you get a death benefit that can also double as long-term care should you need it somewhere down the road.
Now, you had mentioned the zero tax bracket. Probably, most people might not have ever heard of that term, and which is what you in your book is a power of zero. Would you explain what getting to the 0% tax bracket means?
Yeah, well, basically, the premise of my book is that a lot of experts out there have looked at the math and they say, hey, look, there's no way to deliver on all of these promises for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which we're required to pay by law, by the way. We can't get out of those expenses unless the law gets changed. So we're required to pay Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Most experts can't see how we're able to deliver on all of those promises without doubling taxes over time. Here's the problem. If you're currently in a, say, 24% tax bracket and tax rates double, now you're giving away nearly 50% of your 401k distributions, your pension, what have you, back to the IRS in the form of taxes. So the point of the 0% tax bracket approach is to say, hey, if you're in the 0% tax bracket and tax rates double, 2 times 0 is still 0. So the only way to truly insulate yourself from the impact of higher taxes is to get to the 0% tax bracket. Why? Because 2 times 0 is still 0. So it's this whole idea of accumulating the right amounts of money in the right types of accounts such that by the time you hit retirement, you can take 5 or 6 different distributions from these buckets, and they don't show up on the IRS's radar. And you're completely immune or insulated from the impact of higher taxes.
You had mentioned the government's obligation to pay Social Security, and in your movie, The Power of Zero, the tax train is coming. You'd mentioned that when Social Security first was created, there were 42 workers for every one person of claiming that. Now, how's that look? Has that changed? Oh no, I'm sorry. Let me expand on that question, because at that point also the life expectancy was 65.
Right.
So will you bring us up to date on what we are looking at now?
Yeah. So something happened with World War II. Soldiers came home from World War II. They started to do something at a rate at which they'd never done it before. They started to have babies, right? And they proceeded to have 78 million children. So we have 78 million people in our country who are now marching out of the workforce onto the rolls of entitlement programs. They've stopped putting money in. They're going to want to start taking money out. Here's the issue. Baby boomers did not have nearly as many children as their parents did. They had almost 30 million fewer children. So now we have Generation Xers. I'm a Generation X. You guys look like you're Generation X.
I am. I think Cameron's a millennial.
Okay, so he's
right on the back end.
Okay, right on the cusp. So we're now in a position where there's 30 million fewer of us, and we have to somehow pay the bills for 78 million Americans, and there's just not enough of us to go round. To your point, there are now less than 3 people putting money into Social Security for every one person that takes out. In another 10 years, it's going to be 2 people. The earliest you can draw on Social Security today is 62. And if you start drawing at 62, you'll continue to draw on average for 23 years. When Social Security first started out, the average benefit period was only 2 years. So it went from being an insurance policy against living too long, and it slowly morphed into a pension program that covers us for nearly a quarter of our lives. And this is at the root of why our country is on this collision course with bankruptcy, because we have simply promised way more than we can afford to deliver, and the cost of delivering on those promises, if we follow through with them, will bankrupt our country.
We've talked a lot of times when people talk about taxes, or we talk about the government and the deficit. We focus on taxes and tax rate and the revenue the government is bringing in. But like any business, or I don't know if I don't want to call the government a business, but any household, there's really 2 pieces. There's cash flow coming in and there's cash flow coming out. And if we were to look at our GDP and even the amount of taxes this country has seen over the last 10 years, it's gone up by quite a bit. So shouldn't there be enough income to pay for all these things?
Well, the truth is most of the money hasn't been spent yet. I'm not so much concerned, although we are running $1 trillion deficits. That's not a huge deal in the big scheme of things. The big problem is that most of the money that we've promised hasn't been spent yet. So this is really the calm before the storm. Chapter 1 of my book is The Gathering Storm. People aren't really freaking out about it because the worst of it is not yet upon us. But we're moving into a future where we're going to quickly have $2 trillion deficits. We'll get to the point where we have $53 trillion of debt as a country. When we have $53 trillion of debt, all of the revenue flowing into the U.S. Treasury at that point under today's tax rates would only be enough to pay the interest on all that debt, let alone any principal, let alone any benefits for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. So really, we're on this completely unsustainable fiscal trajectory, and nobody in Congress wants to talk about it or address it because it's simply not very popular. It's inconvenient as a politician to talk about addressing these types of issues.
That's funny. That's a really good comment. It made me think of my question earlier is that, why why is there a disconnect between what people believe taxes are going up and then what they're doing? Is, I personally believe it's because they haven't felt that pressure, or they haven't seen taxes go up personally in their lifetime, right? And so they've never seen it, they've never witnessed it, so it's just kind of that intangible thing that's out there. But if you look internationally and globally, you see this happening quite a bit lately in the last 5 to 10 years. So
yeah, we interviewed for our movie, we interviewed a whole host of experts, all of which know much more about this stuff than I do. We interviewed a congressman out of California whose name is Tom McClintock. He's on the Republican Budget Committee. He told us off the record, and we weren't filming when he said this. We said, hey, look, things are so bad that in 8 years we're going to be Venezuela. So we're the types of things where we sort of look on in horror and observe what's going on in Venezuela or perhaps Greece. Well, we're going to get to the point where things are even worse than what we're experiencing in Venezuela. And all of the people that aren't motivated by elections have caught on to this, and they all seem to agree. There's a guy named Mark Sanford, former governor of South Carolina. He's actually running for president against Trump. Most people don't realize this because there's no way he's ever going to win. But he says the reason he's running is because if he decides to run 4 years from now, he says he feels like from a financial standpoint, it will be too late for our country to do anything about it. So he feels like he has to primary Trump today, if for no other reason, to get a platform for these financial issues.
You mentioned a couple of the big names that you had on there. I love the movie, and it seemed like a huge undertaking. You've got some very well-respected, very well notable individuals on there. How'd you even get started on a project like that?
Well, it's tough because when you start off, you don't have anybody in your movie. And
yeah,
the first 2 weeks, we didn't know if we were going to get anybody. But you know what? All you need is you need to get that first big name, and then you can wield that as you're approaching some of these other experts. So I had known David Walker for a while. He had collaborated with me on chapter 1 of his book. I actually approached him at one of his events, said, hey, I'm writing a book, the first chapter of which talks about you. He gave me his card and said, let's talk about it. So I gave him editorial control over chapter 1 of The Power of Zero. And so I had known David Walker. And so when it came time to film this movie, he was very gracious in allowing us to come to his home in Connecticut in the middle of a campaign where he's running for governor of Connecticut. And once we got David Walker, we could get Larry Kotlikoff, who's a very respected PhD out of Boston University. Once we got Larry Kotlikoff, we could get George Shultz, former Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan. And once you get George Shultz, you can get just about anybody.
Now, you'd mentioned David Walker, and he had written an article, or he'd mentioned posted something with CNN, that in order to pay for this deficit, that we'd have to double the tax rates. Now, that was a while back, and since then, our national debt is growing and growing. Has he said anything? Do we need to triple rates now?
Well, this is the unusual thing, and I'm glad you brought it up. David Walker was running around the country with his hair on fire, talking about this back in 2009. He even created a movie called IOUSA that got nominated for an Oscar. If not for Man on a Wire, he would have won. He came in second place, apparently. So he was making a really big deal about this back in 2009. Guess what? Back then, the national debt was only $10 trillion. So here we are, 10 years later. We're at $23 trillion, and you're not hearing a peep from just about anybody. The only ones that are talking about this are a few lone voices in the wilderness. Certainly the people in our movie share this sentiment. But Larry Kotlikoff, Dr. Kotlikoff out of Boston University, he's really one of the foremost experts on the national debt. He believes in something called fiscal gap accounting. Fiscal gap accounting basically says, hey, look, the true national debt is not $22 trillion because it doesn't include the off-the-books obligations for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. He says, if you project forward 70 years, like every other country in the world does, and say, how much do we owe for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid interest on the debt versus what we can actually afford to deliver under current tax rates, he says the difference between that, if you figure out the net present value of that future difference or that future obligation, he says you would have to have $239 trillion sitting in the bank account today earning treasury rates to be able to deliver on all those promises. How much do we actually have? Zippo. So we've got this huge fiscal gap that has to be accounted for. So the real national debt's not 22 trillion. If we stated our debt like every other developed country in the world states their debt, we would have to tell the whole world that we have $239 trillion. Our debt to GDP ratio is not 105%. It's closer to 1,000%. Second place country in the world is Japan with 250% debt to GDP ratio. So we are way, way more worse off today than we ever were in 2009 when David Walker was making a big deal about it. And ironically, it seems like fewer people are even talking about it.
You're right. And I think part of it is people are very short-minded. And right now, the economy's good. Unemployment's down, stock market's up, the value of your house is up. Like everything's good. And the thing is, when things are good, that's when it's time to save or to start paying down debt. And it seems like even though we've generated more tax revenue these last 10 years, in fact, one stat that I really enjoyed from the movie was over the last 10 years, inflation had gone up 26%. Revenue had gone up 35%, which is great. So just as you said in there, it's not a revenue problem, but the spending went up 49%. I mean, I just think no matter how much comes in, it is never going to be enough.
Well, Maya McGinnis, who is part of an organization out of Washington, I think it's a government think tank. She's really made it her mission as well to try to lobby for fiscal sanity in Washington. And she says, look, we're in this period of relative prosperity. Every other country in the world is getting their financial houses in order, except for the United States. We're throwing debt on the national credit card hand over fist. And so instead of paying down all of this debt that we've accumulated over these years with these, these surpluses in the Treasury, we're actually increasing debt at rates that we haven't seen since World War II. So this is a scary proposition, and we have, I try to remain as apolitical as possible, but you've got, on the one hand, you got Donald Trump who campaigned on the platform of not touching Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and then on the other side of the aisle, you've got the likes of, for example, Elizabeth Warren, who wants to add $30 trillion to all of the to the national budget in the form of Medicare for all. So on both sides of the aisle, people are just living in this dream world that's not rooted in reality. And until somebody can take the bull by the horns and say, let's get real about our financial position and the fiscal solvency in our country, we are likely going to get to this crisis point when tax rates will have to be raised and raised dramatically in order for us to stay out of bankruptcy.
So what we just kind of covered there was really debt, right, is increasing, getting thrown on top of debt and going up. We have taxes that are going to increase, right? You can tell us the day and the year in which they're going to go up. We have spending that's going to go up. When that happens, right, the government is going to be looking for revenue. And what types of accounts are they going to go to, right, to tap in to pay some of these liabilities that they have? And then also in turn is, what are some accounts that clients or listeners can turn to avoid some of that?
Well, they're gonna be looking in all quarters for new revenue. They're gonna be looking to tax your IRAs and 401ks. They're gonna be looking to tax your income. They're gonna be looking to raise capital gains tax rates on your other investments. They're gonna be looking everywhere for more revenue. Just to give you an idea on this, people say, hey, what if we get to the point where everybody has money in tax-free accounts, nobody has money in tax-deferred accounts? What's going to happen then? Well, I don't think we're in any danger of that happening anytime soon. According to my latest research, there's about $23 trillion in the cumulative IRAs and 401ks of Americans across the country, which not coincidentally is about the same level as our debt. If you look at how much are in the cumulative Roth IRAs, Roth 401ks, Roth conversions of Americans, it's only about 800 to 900 billion. It's like a 25 to 1 ratio. So they're not going to be raising money on our Roth IRAs and Roth 401ks because there's not enough money in there to make a hell of a beans of difference over time. They're going to be looking to raise tax rates on our income, on our investments, and particularly on 401ks and IRAs.
Now, what do you think is one of your strategies, and one thing a lot of our listeners have is life insurance? Right now, there's special, there was life insurance before there was the IRS. Do you, in your experience, do you hear any talk, or do you think there's some risk there to be taxing growth in life insurance?
Yeah, anything's possible. As a country slides slowly into insolvency, they get desperate and they start looking for revenue in places that maybe they haven't really seriously looked before. One of the things that I do like about life insurance and life insurance retirement plan, LIRP, is that if history serves as a model, whoever has these policies in force today, before potentially a law were to get changed, gets to keep that bucket of money and continue to put money into it under the old rule for the rest of their lives. We call that our grandfather clause. They changed the rules on these programs in 82, 84, and 88, and every single time they changed the rules, they simply said whoever has the bucket today gets to keep it and continue to put money into it under the old rule for the rest of their lives. So I think there will come a time, given this fiscal path that we seem to be navigating as a country, there will come a time when they will likely start to tax the dickens out of these programs. But if, like I said, if past is prologue, we should be able to continue to contribute to these programs because they'll be grandfathered under the old rule.
Good.
And David, you're recording. Where do you live right now? Where are you residing?
I live on the sunny island of Puerto Rico.
And it's funny. I heard that you were there, baby.
Look there.
Maybe a month or so ago. Look at that. That's beautiful. And if you could tell us why you ended up there.
Well, so the sun was certainly part of it, but maybe only about 10%. I came to find out that there is a law enacted, I believe in 2011. It's Act 20 and Act 22. And under the Act 20, if you are a qualified business and you move your business and your family and your life to Puerto Rico, you become a Puerto Rico resident, then they will waive your federal tax, they will waive your state tax, and they will charge you a flat 4% tax. So the net effect is like removing a zero from your tax bill, or doubling your income. So the thought occurred to me, if I can get twice as much work done in half the amount of time, then maybe I can accelerate towards my goals in life twice as fast. And so we've came here initially for that reason, but really it's a great place to live. We love being here. I've got 7 children. They all seem to really, really like it. My wife, most importantly, seems to really like it. So we plan on being here and enjoying a near tax-free lifestyle for the foreseeable future.
Wow.
That's great. I heard about it, and I have some clients that are actually looking into it, looking into moving down there. So maybe I'll do some research on the Act 20, Act 22, or put you guys in touch somehow.
Act 22, by the way, waives all your federal gains, all of your capital gains taxes. So that's so all of the investing you do feels like a massive, unlimited Roth IRA. So that's also an appealing part of it.
That is appealing. Wow.
Well, I could see that even be more if you're anticipating large capital gain, like you're selling your business.
There's a lot of hedge funds have moved down here for precisely that reason.
Well, David, thank you so much for your time. Where can our listeners find you? Where can they find your book? I know there's a couple different places if they want it individually or bulk. Could you give us that information?
Yeah, you bet. They can go to davidmcknight.com/books, and they can get all 3 of my books there. Actually, you can't buy them in bulk there. If you want to buy them in bulk, you actually have to go to powerzero.com/books. But if you just want a single copy, which I imagine most of your listeners would be interested in, they can just go to davidmcknight.com/books.
Perfect. We'll be sure to add that to the show notes.
And then where can they get access to the documentary, The Power of Zero, The Tax Train is Coming?
That can be streamed pretty much anywhere movies are streamed. You can buy it or rent it on YouTube, on Amazon, on iTunes. Pretty much anywhere you can stream a movie, they can either rent it or purchase it and watch it right there in the comfort of your home.
Great. Thanks, David. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you panning out. I don't know if these listeners are seeing it, but David had moved his webcam so we could see how beautiful it is in Puerto Rico. And we're filming this at the end of November. In Las Vegas, where we're at, it's still somewhat sunny, but most parts of the United States are not. So thanks, Dave, for rubbing that in.
Hey, no problem. I'm here to help.
Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on the next episode. Also, check out our website, infinitewealthconsultants.com, to find our podcast along with other additional resources.